I got Pearl's permission to tell a story. I was check if I remember growing up. Every Sunday mornings could be quite terrifying for the kids of the preacher because you never knew if something was going to come up. And I know my dad tried really hard to check with us ahead of time, but occasionally that didn't happen. So I always asked if I wanted to share a family story. And it was a couple of weeks ago. We were in Toronto. I had just completed 2 major conference events, speaking up to 4 hours at each of them, and big crowds and kind of a lot of stress, but also feeling some satisfaction that that had been ended in a good way. And we had been at our daughter's convocation earlier in the day, and it was this wonderful celebration of 5 years of her hard work. And we'd left her in Waterloo to enjoy some time with her friends, and Pearl and I came to Toronto. And we'd had a lovely dinner at an Indian restaurant where the manager came and had a nice visit with us over dinner, and this very charming guy. It was a just beautiful night. And we're walking back along the busy street in Toronto, and there was a man, as there always is, begging on the side of the street. And I checked my pockets, and I'd had 2 or 3 loonies and toonies, which I'd given away earlier when we were walking, and so didn't have any. I said, I'm out of change. And so thinking we would continue to go by, and Pearl said, I've got a toonie, I think. And she handed it to him, and he took her hand, and I was already a couple steps past her, and he called, he says, "Sir, you have a lovely daughter." Which I'm pretty sure was part of the line. But we all laughed, and had a good chuckle together. And I said, "You're a pretty smooth one, aren't you?" And he said something. We had this moment of interchange, and he continued to hold Pearl's hand. And it was like all of the barriers that separate people kind of disappeared in that moment. Like we were just people enjoying meeting one another on the street. And then, of course, it was brief and it was over, and we went on back to the nice hotel where we were staying, and continued the weekend. But it was this sense of what interrupted all of the grand things of life having some meaning, some important significance that I carry with me from that. And I don't think we really even talked about it, other than saying, that was nice, or whatever it was we went on. And I was recalling that this week as we hear this story. In a number of ways, there are parallels, in a number of ways it's different. But how it seemed to me this morning, the story is about how all of our stories are connected, how they intersect. And Thomas Merton says that if we do not read the gospel with new eyes, if we don't understand it in new ways in each generation and in our lives each time we read it, it becomes dead. And so I'm hearing it a little bit differently than I ever have before, this story about the dying girl and the hemorrhaging woman. The story begins with Jesus coming back to his people, to his community, where he had experienced a fair amount of rejection so far. And the leader of the synagogue, and you can't put too light a note on this, comes to Jesus. And I can only imagine, as one of his disciples, what a wonderful thing this would have felt like, to have the leader of the synagogue coming to ask for help. Not only coming to ask, but throwing himself down at Jesus' feet. This is like Donald Trump coming for help from Jesus, on his knees begging, "My daughter is sick and dying. Please come and help me. If you touch her, she will be made well." Well, I'm sure the disciples thought, finally, big time recognition. If this goes well, Jesus is going to be the superstar that we hoped he would be, and we'll be right there to be all part of it. We can say we knew him when. And so they're forcing their way through the crowd. "Get out of our way, we're going to see this poor sick girl of this very important man who's asking us for help." And, they're on their way, and it's going to be this wonderful thing. And Jesus stops and says, "Who just touched me?" The disciples are like, "Look around, Jesus. There's like 1,000 people here touching you. Like, we got to move along." Jesus, "No." And a woman comes forward and says, It was me. And what the writer of the gospel fills in the blanks for us is that this is a woman who for 12 years had been hemorrhaging, bleeding. And no one could help her. No one could make that right. And she had spent all of her money. She may have been wealthy, but she's clearly poor now. And no one was able to heal her. And she thought to herself, if I just touch Jesus' clothes, I'll be healed. And I think we have to understand that the healing is not just of the physical ailment, because that physical ailment would be one that marginalized her from her whole culture. No one else, I mean, what she had done, she could be expelled from the city, beaten, and even killed for it, touching someone while she was, quote, unclean. She was one who had been pushed to the margin, rejected. Her family would probably not have spoken to her. No one would have gone anywhere near her. And she took the risk of reaching out and touching Jesus. And somehow her experience of being on the margin, her experience of being rejected, her experience of being the one that no one would touch or come near was healed. And then people come and say to Jesus and to Jairus, don't bother. Your daughter has died. There's no point in going ahead. Why bother the teacher any longer? And Jesus says to Jairus, just have faith. And they go, and the people are already there mourning, professionals. They had paid mourners, screaming and crying, as well as people who maybe really cared. And they said, she's dead. And Jesus said, no, she's just sleeping. And they laughed at him, and he threw them out of the house. And they go up to where the girl is, and they say, he says, Talitha kum, which I've heard a number of people say if they ever had a daughter, they would name her Talitha. You know, it means little girl, get up. And he touched her, and she was alive. And he said, don't tell anyone about it, but we've been telling people about it for 2,000 years. And he says, give her something to eat. That's the story. And what I'm really aware of is the way the two stories are woven together, either by the gospel writer, the writer of Mark, who wrote these stories down 20 years later, or just how they were interwoven in life, and he was just recording them. But for some reason, the author of the Gospel of Mark chose to write, to have those stories. Like all of us, there are millions of stories, millions of events in our lives. We remember some and not others. And for some reason, this was a story the Christian community, the early followers of Jesus, carried with them for a long time. And I think part of it is because the two stories of the women weave together. Think about it. First of all, the woman had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. The writer of the Gospel of Mark makes a point of saying the girl was 12 years old. And there are some scholars who would even suggest that the woman was the girl's mother and the hemorrhaging began when she was born. There's no evidence of that, but it's an interesting thing to think about, how the birth of this beloved child had meant the rejection of her mother because of the hemorrhaging. 12 is an important number. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. They had this in common. They also had in common that, in a sense, they were both unclean. This woman for 12 years and untouchable. And the girl, as a dead person, untouchable as well. Only certain people would touch a dead person because they were considered unclean, defiled. And the woman touches Jesus, and Jesus touches the girl. And it's hard for us to understand the significance of that. But Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, would know how important that was. You don't let unclean people touch you, and you do not touch what is unclean. And yet, that's what's happening. There are also, there's differences too. One girl, Precious, the beloved daughter of Jairus, and one woman, rejected, unincluded, untouchable. And did you catch what Jesus calls this woman? He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Both daughters. One rejected, one precious. Both daughters. It's a very powerful thing that happens if you can take that in. That both of these women, a girl and a woman, are named daughter. We know Jairus' name, we know Jesus' name. He names the disciples who are with him, Peter, James, John, the brother of James. I guess brother James doesn't get his name said. But they don't name these two women other than to refer to them as daughter, beloved of the Holy. So this is the story that we host, of stories weaving together. It sounds like two stories. Why didn't Mark, tell them one at a time? Why did he put them together? Maybe they happened that way. I think he tells them together to remind us that we are part of a web where all of our stories connect with one another. This is Canada Day. And in Canada, one of the things that shape the dynamic and culture of who we understand ourselves to be is a certain understanding through nationality. And that's being stretched more and more as those who are part of the community, those who bring different stories than we were used to, become part of the community. And it was pointed out to me this week that over the last weeks, we've probably been hearing a lot about the celebration or the recognition of the War of 1812, right? There are going to be reenactments, and we're going to beat the Americans again, even though we weren't Canadians at the time, but that's not the point. It's this wonderful celebration of how we drove them back at the borders. Of course, in the U.S., they're telling a different story. But no one has mentioned that today is also the 50th anniversary of the beginning of Medicare, of universal health care. On July 1st, 1952, the Saskatchewan government said everybody in the province gets health care. There shouldn't be different care for poor people and rich people. Health is an inalienable right. It's something that connects us tissue to tissue, story to story with one another. And we celebrate that now in many ways, but we forget that also the doctors went on strike for 23 days and refused to work during that time in response to not wanting to be paid or involved with the government, and all of the health care actually responded in that way. And many of the provinces didn't accept it initially. Not until the federal government finally was shamed into saying, okay, we'll pay 50% of health care. And then even Alberta said, well, it's embarrassing to turn that down. And so they became part of it too. And it's a part of our identity, part of our understanding of being what it means to be a people where our stories intersect, where the health of the person on the margin is as important as the health of the precious daughter of a powerful man. That those connections cannot be ignored, and that we want to embody that somehow as a nation. For me, as I wrestle in my life with my understanding of how to talk about God who is beyond my comprehension so many times, who's beyond words that I can describe, one of the ways I think of God is the simple idea that God is love. Not that God is a being or that God is in everything, but God is the connective tissue of all people, of all creation. That if we could see it, there will be lines of energy and love connecting me to you and you to me and one another and to all the world around us. And it's overwhelming to imagine. But I think there's some of that in this story. Some of that where we are reminded that God's love is not just for the privileged, that God's healing is not just for those who are most powerful or wealthy. It is for all. Because all of us will be named in the healing, daughter, son, beloved of God. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.